He was just a tired mechanic in a forgotten town, grieving quietly, fixing what others had given up on. Then one stormy night, a lost little girl appeared on his doorstep. No name, no past, and no one looking for her. What began as an act of kindness turned into something neither of them could have imagined. This is not a story about fate. It's about choice, about showing up when it matters most, and about the kind of love that doesn't need blood to be real. Before we begin, if stories about hope, healing, and the quiet strength of the human heart mean something to you, consider subscribing to our channel. We share true-to-life tales that uplift, inspire, and remind us all of the beauty in everyday acts of compassion. Now let me tell you the story of a man, a child, and the home they built together when the world had all but forgotten them. A poor mechanic took in a lost child. 20 years ago, she returned in a limo with his name on the deed. The rain fell in relentless sheets that evening, painting the small town of Willoughby in gray and sorrow. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling loose window panes and bending the brittle branches of sycamores that lined the old county road. Inside a dimly lit garage at the town's edge, Earl Jennings tightened the last bolt beneath a rust-eaten pickup. His knuckles bloodied his breath, fogging in the cold. He was in his 40s but looked older. Years of labor had carved valleys into his face, and loss had taken up permanent residence in his eyes. His work shirt clung to him, soaked through at the shoulders where the roof leaked, but Earl didn't notice. Not anymore. He worked late into the night, not because there was anyone waiting for him, but because no one was. Just as he reached for a wrench, a faint sound caught his attention. Something not mechanical. A cry, a child's cry, muffled, fragile, carried by the wind. Earl stilled. He waited. There it was again. He wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and stepped outside where the rain bit at his skin like tiny needles. His eyes scanned the empty road, the weeping trees, the distant flicker of a failing street lamp. Then he saw her. A small figure, barely more than a shadow, stood on the edge of the roadside ditch, drenched and shivering. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her long blonde hair clung to her face like wet ribbon. She wore a dress far too thin for this kind of weather, and her shoes, if you could call them, that were nothing more than soggy slippers. Earl approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hey there," he called over the roar of the wind. "You all right, sweetheart?" The girl flinched and took a step back, nearly slipping in the mud. Her arms hugged a small, dirty, stuffed rabbit against her chest. Earl stopped giving her space. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said gently. "Name's Earl. I work over there." He gestured to the garage where a dim yellow light spilled onto the gravel. "Why don't we get you out of the rain?" She didn't speak, but she didn't run either. He took off his jacket, rough denim lined with flannel, and stepped closer, holding it open. "Come on now, you'll catch your death." There was a long pause, then finally the girl nodded. Just once, Earl wrapped the coat around her tiny shoulders and led her toward the garage, her hand cold and small in his. Inside, the space smelled of oil rubber and something faintly like home. Earl pulled an old wool blanket from the office sofa and wrapped it around the girl, then set a mug of warm cocoa. He always kept a tin for the rare customer on the desk beside her. She stared at it wide-eyed. "Want to tell me your name?" he asked, kneeling to her level. She looked down at the rabbit, then up at him. "Sophie," she whispered. "Sophie," he repeated with a soft smile. "That's a pretty name. You got a last name, Sophie." Her lips trembled. I don't know." Earl's brow furrowed. "Where's your family? Your mom, dad?" Silence. He waited patient. "I ran away," she said at last. They forgot me." Earl's heart clenched. The rain outside had eased to a steady whisper against the tin roof, but inside the storm still brewed. "Forgot you," he echoed. Sophie nodded, hugging the rabbit tighter. "I was at a big house, a party. I went outside to find my bunny, and when I came back, everyone was gone." "How long ago was that?" She shrugged. "It got dark. I walked for a long time. I got lost." Earl stood rubbing his neck. The rational part of him knew what he should do. Call the police. Get child services involved. Let the system do what it was made for. But there was something in the way. Sophie stared at the cocoa, like it was the first act of kindness she'd known in a long while, that made him hesitate. "You're safe now," he said. "You want to stay here tonight?" "Just tonight. I got a cot in the back and I'll keep the heater on." Sophie nodded again, this time without hesitation. Later that night, Earl lay awake in the office chair, the cot occupied by a sleeping Sophie, who clutched the stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. The heater buzzed softly, casting golden light across the girl's peaceful face. Earl remembered what it felt like to carry a child up the stairs, to tuck them in, to feel the quiet weight of trust when little arms wrapped around his neck. It had been years since his daughter passed, years since the accident, since the woman he loved faded into the quiet echo of memory. Now here was this child, lost, forgotten, possibly abandoned, appearing like a ghost in the storm. He leaned back, hands behind his head, eyes on the ceiling stained with time and regret. He told himself this was temporary, that tomorrow he'd do the right thing. Call the authorities, let the professionals handle it. But deep down in the part of him he rarely listened to anymore, he already knew he would not let her go. Not tonight, not ever. The morning came soft and silver, with dew gathered like pearls on the grass outside Earl's modest garage. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, warming the oil-stained floor, and the old tools hanging silently on the pegboard. A kettle whistled on the hot plate in the office, breaking the stillness with a sound that somehow felt louder than it should have. Earl poured 2 mugs of instant coffee, only one of them sweetened with a spoonful of sugar and a splash of milk. He set the sweeter cup on the desk near the cot where Sophie was still curled beneath a wool blanket, far too big for her. Her chest rose and fell in slow rhythm. For a moment Earl just watched. He'd always thought grief dulled with time, but he'd been wrong. It didn't fade, it just changed shape. Sometimes it looked like silence. Other times it looked exactly like the small hand that had gripped his shirt all night, as if it were the only safe thing in the world. Sophie stirred, blinking awake. Her hair stuck up at odd angles, and the rabbit she clutched had fallen to the floor. She rubbed her eyes and looked around disoriented. "You're all right," Earl said gently. "It's morning." She sat up slowly. "I didn't dream it, did I?" "Nope." He gave her a small smile. "You're still here, and I made you some cocoa. Or, well, coffee, kind of. It's sweet." She picked up the mug with both hands, sniffed it, and smiled, just barely. Earl sat across from her and waited. "You sleep okay?" Sophie nodded, then quietly, "You didn't leave." "No, sweetheart, I didn't." A pause stretched between them. Earl looked out the window toward the road, already imagining the sirens, the questions, the paperwork, the social worker asking if he was mentally fit to take care of a child after what he'd been through. But Sophie's voice pulled him back. "Do I have to go somewhere today?" Earl hesitated. Every responsible instinct screamed yes. Every man of the law molecule in his body said, "You're not her family. You're not even legally allowed to keep her here." But then he saw the way her eyes dropped, the way her little shoulders braced for rejection. She already knew what the answer was supposed to be, and Earl Jennings had broken rules before, for much less important things. "Not today," he said. A breath of relief slipped from her lips, small but unmistakable. The hours passed quietly. Earl called in to cancel his usual jobs, something he hadn't done in years. He and Sophie sat on a bench behind the garage, eating peanut butter sandwiches and watching a pair of squirrels argue in a nearby tree. Sophie didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. Earl had spent most of his life listening to silence and learning what it meant. He noticed the way she never let the rabbit out of her sight, the way she flinched at the sound of a car backfiring in the distance, the way her eyes scanned every open space like she wasn't sure she was allowed to exist there. By early afternoon, Earl knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, whoever had left this girl behind hadn't just made a mistake. They had abandoned her. Second, he couldn't let her disappear into a system that would chew her up and spit her out. He didn't have much: a cot, a half-working heater, a beat-up pickup, and a name no one in town cared much about anymore. But he had something the people at that party didn't: a heart that refused to stop caring. That night, as Sophie colored quietly at the corner of his desk with a stub of red pencil he found in the drawer, Earl sat on the phone with his old friend from high school, Rachel, who now worked as a nurse at the county hospital and had a son in the sheriff's department. "You're doing what she asked. I just need to know if anyone's reported a missing kid." A pause, Then why do I get the feeling you're not asking for a friend? Earl glanced at Sophie. She was humming softly off-key, lost in her drawing. No reports, he pressed. Rachel sighed. Not in this county, I'll check the neighboring ones. But Earl, this is serious. You can't just keep a child. I'm not keeping her. I'm giving her a place to stay for now. Earl, I know what it sounds like. But listen, Rach, she's scared to death. She doesn't know her last name. She thinks she was left on purpose. Rachel didn't speak for a long while, then softly, "Are you sure you can do this again?" That question stung more than she probably intended. Earl leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. "No," he said, "but maybe that's not the point." Later that night, as he tucked Sophie into the cot, she surprised him by asking, "Did you ever have a little girl?" Earl's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said softly. "A long time ago." "What happened?" "There was a car accident." He tried to keep his voice steady. "She didn't make it." Sophie looked down. "I'm sorry, me too." She looked at him again, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," he replied. There was a silence. Then Sophie turned to face the wall, her voice trembling, as she said, "Maybe she sent me." Earl sat there for a long moment, unable to speak. The garage had never felt more like a home. The next few days settled into a quiet makeshift rhythm. Earl made pancakes in the mornings, even though his batter was more lumps than fluff. Sophie sat cross-legged on the old floor tiles of the garage's office, coloring on the backs of invoices with whatever pencils Earl could dig out from drawers long untouched. At night, she fell asleep to the hum of an old space heater, her small frame swallowed up in wool blankets, her stuffed rabbit nestled securely beneath her chin. Each day, Earl told himself, "Just one more day. Then I'll do what's right." But each morning when he looked into Sophie's eyes, so alert, yet so fragile, he pushed the decision further down the road. The girl wasn't just a mystery. She was a wound in the shape of a child. She rarely talked about where she came from. When Earl asked, she offered short answers or none at all, as if she'd learned early how dangerous the truth could be. She didn't know her last name. She didn't know the town she'd been in. The only things she did remember were flashes, a big room with mirrors, a lady who wore diamonds even in the kitchen, a man who never smiled, not even when people laughed. She hadn't come from a small town like Willoughby. That much was clear. Her words were careful, her posture oddly refined for a child who had wandered alone into the woods in the middle of a storm. But the scariest thing Earl realized was how accustomed she seemed to being invisible. On the third day, the local sheriff dropped by for a routine visit. Earl had nearly forgotten they did those anymore. Sheriff Donahue was a heavy-set man with a fondness for black coffee and an eye for what didn't belong. He leaned against the front of the garage while Earl checked the oil on a neighbor's sedan. "Been a while, Earl," he said casually. "Heard you canceled all your repair jobs this week." "Thought that was strange." Earl didn't look up. "Yeah, well, been busy." "That's so." There was a pause. Donahue sipped from a thermos marked with faded army decals. "Someone saw a little girl around here. Said she's not from town." Earl paused, then tightened the oil cap with a bit more force than necessary. "I found her during the storm." She was alone. Donahue narrowed his eyes. "Alone where? Near Old Mill Road. Wet, freezing, not a soul in sight, and you didn't think to call it in." Earl looked up now. "I was going to, but she was scared out of her mind. I figured I'd let her get warm first, calm down. It's only been a couple of days." Donahue wasn't a bad man, but he lived by the book, and the book didn't take kindly to gray areas. "Look," he said after a moment, "you've always had a good heart, Earl, but you know you can't just keep a child. There are systems for this." Earl wiped his hands on a rag. "Yeah, systems that lose kids in the cracks." "You think I don't know how that works?" Donahue said nothing. "She's not ready for that," Earl continued. "She doesn't even know who she is. And until someone comes forward, and no one has, she stays here." The sheriff sighed, eyes softening. "You're walking a line, buddy. I've been walking it for years." That night, Earl sat on the back steps of the garage with a mug of weak coffee and watched the fireflies blink over the field like scattered stars. Sophie appeared beside him barefoot, her dress brushing the tops of her ankles. She didn't say anything, just sat. After a long moment, she asked, "Did the sheriff take people away?" Earl hesitated. "He can, if he thinks someone's in danger." Was I in danger? He looked at her. Really looked. Her face held that question the way a soldier might carry a wound visible, but never spoken of directly. No, he said, you're not now. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I think I had a piano, she whispered after a while. At the house, it was white. Do you play? I used to. But they said I made too much noise. Earl felt his chest tighten. What kind of home told a child to stop making music? You can be as noisy as you want here, he said softly. She looked up at him, a tentative smile blooming like a shy flower. Really, absolutely. You want to learn how to use a socket wrench too? Her smile widened. By the end of the week, the town had begun to notice Mrs. Callahan from the grocery store dropped off a bag of secondhand clothes. A retired teacher from the church left a box of books labeled Level 2, Readers on the Porch. Even old man Hayes, who hadn't spoken to Earl in years, nodded at him outside the post office and muttered, Heard you got company. Good on you, Earl never asked for help. But kindness, like loneliness, had a way of multiplying when shared. And so for the first time in years, Earl Jennings began to hope. He hoped the girl who spoke softly and smiled rarely might find her voice again. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, love didn't have to be something you buried with the past. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, tonight was enough. The first cold snap of the season came earlier than expected, creeping in like an uninvited guest through the cracks in the old garage walls. Earl woke up stiff and aching, the space heater rattling its protest against the deep November chill. He reached for his flannel shirt and threw a second blanket over Sophie, who was still curled into a ball, her breath rising in soft little puffs. She had been there almost a month now. They'd formed a routine. Mornings were for pancakes, he'd gotten better at it, she said, and afternoons were for stories or watching Earl tinker under the hood of someone's broken-down car. She was fascinated by engines, the way all the moving parts had to work together to create something that ran. Maybe it made sense to her. After all, she'd come from a life full of pieces that had never quite fit. But as the leaves turned brittle and the light died earlier each day, a quiet urgency began to settle in Earl's chest. He didn't talk about it, but it was there. The world was watching now, people were asking questions, and winter was coming. That morning, Earl and Sophie sat at the small table in the garage's back office, sharing a breakfast of oatmeal and toast Sophie had taken to braiding her hair into uneven pigtails, and she wore a red wool sweater donated by the pastor's wife that hung nearly to her knees. Your handwriting's getting better, Earl said, nodding toward the lined notebook where she was practicing her letters. I want to write my name, she said quietly. My whole name. Earl hesitated. We'll figure it out, sweetheart. Might take some time. What if I don't have one? He put down his mug. Everybody's got a name. Just, some folks forget where it came from. That doesn't mean it isn't yours. She nodded slowly, processing that. Then can I choose one that caught him off guard? You mean a name? Yeah, since I don't remember it, can I pick one that means something? He studied her for a long second. There was something about the question, so earnest, so quietly brave, that brought a lump to his throat. You sure can, he said finally. Names aren't just labels, they're promises. So pick something that matters. She smiled, then looked down at her paper, gripping the pencil a little tighter. That afternoon, Earl made a call. He hadn't spoken to Marlene Jensen in years, not since she retired from the county clerk's office. But she picked up on the second ring. Earl Jennings, she said clearly, surprised. Well, if this isn't a ghost from the past. Hey, Marlene, I need a favor. The conversation was cautious at first. Earl wasn't a man who asked for things, and Marlene knew that. But when he explained about Sophie, how she had no last name, no records, how no one had come forward, her voice softened. You're saying this girl has no birth certificate, no social security number, I don't think. So if she does, no one's found it yet. No reports, no missing child alerts, nothing. She just vanished into the system. She never entered it, from what I can tell. Marlene exhaled. That's rare, but not impossible. Especially with the kinds of folks who don't want to leave a paper trail. Earl's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not trying to adopt her. Not officially, I just want to make sure she's not dragged into something worse than where she came from. There was a pause, then Marlene asked, Does she want to stay with you? She hasn't said it outright. But yeah, she wants to stay. Then let me see what I can do. Earl's voice cracked as he replied, Thank you. That night the temperature dropped below freezing. The old radiator groaned like an old man with tired bones. Earl layered Sophie in 2 pairs of socks and put her cot closer to the heater. But he could see the cold in her cheeks, the way she hugged her rabbit like it could keep her heart warm. She didn't complain. She never did. Instead, she asked, Why do people leave? The question floated in the room like breath in the cold air. Earl sat down beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. Sometimes he said slowly, People are scared or selfish, or they don't know how to love someone right. Is that why my family left me? I don't know. But what I do know is, it wasn't your fault. She nodded, but Earl knew the words would take time to sink in. Some truths had to be repeated 100 times before a child would believe them, especially one who'd learned the hard way, not to trust love too easily. After a moment, she reached into her notebook and held it up to him. At the top of the page, in neat but uneven letters, she had written, Sophie Grace. Earl smiled. Grace. Huh. It means a second chance, she said. His throat tightened again. Well, he said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. That sounds about right. The next morning brought a layer of frost across the grass, and with it news Earl wasn't ready for a white sedan rolled up to the garage just before noon. Out stepped a woman in a gray trench coat, crisp slacks and high heels that didn't belong anywhere near gravel. She introduced herself as Caroline Brent, a representative from the County Family Services Division. Mr. Jennings, she said, extending a hand, we've received a report of an undocumented minor under your care. Earl felt the blood drain from his face. Who filed it? She didn't answer. I'm not trying to hide her, he said quickly. She came to me during the storm alone. I've been trying to find answers, I believe you, she said, her tone not unkind, but until we verify her background, she'll need to be placed in a temporary care facility. Sophie had stepped into the doorway behind him, her eyes wide and terrified. No, she said barely above a whisper. Caroline turned, kneeling gently. Hi there, Sophie. I'm here to help, I promise. No, Sophie said louder, this time I'm staying. Earl stepped between them. There has to be another way, Caroline studied him carefully. You have 48 hours to provide any documents that prove legal guardianship. After that, I'm afraid the law doesn't allow for exceptions. Then she handed him a business card and walked back to her car, heels clicking against the frozen ground, like a clock counting down. Sophie looked up at Earl. Are they going to take me? He crouched down and gripped her shoulders gently. Not if I can help it. Earl didn't sleep that night. The wind clawed at the windows like it wanted in, and the cold seemed sharper, more personal, as if the world itself had turned against him. He sat hunched over his workbench in the garage, the soft ticking of a wall clock marking each passing second like a countdown. He couldn't stop. 48 hours to stop a bureaucratic machine that had already decided Sophie's fate. He dealt with machines his whole life. Broken axles seized pistons, engines that coughed and sputtered until you gave them exactly what they needed. But this was different. The system didn't want to be fixed. It didn't want truth or context or compassion. It wanted paperwork, and he didn't have any. By mid-morning, he was on the phone with Marlene again. I don't have good news, she said wearily. Nothing on file, no missing persons report, no hospital record matching her age or description. It's like she never existed. She's here, Earl said, breathing, laughing. Learning that should count for something. It does, Marlene said gently. To you, maybe even to me, but not to the state. There was a pause on the line. Listen, she continued. I've seen this happen before. The good ones always think love will be enough to keep a child safe. But you and I both know sometimes it's not. Earl felt his jaw tighten. Then help me make it enough. A sigh, I'll call a friend over in county records. See if there's a loophole, maybe an emergency guardianship clause. But Earl, don't hang your hopes on this. These people don't bend easy. He hung up and turned to see Sophie standing quietly in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. She knew something was wrong. That afternoon, Earl took her into town, something he hadn't done since she arrived. Not because he was hiding her, But because the town had a long memory and he wasn't sure which version of him people still carried in their minds, the man who buried a daughter or the one who hadn't spoken above a whisper since. But Sophie needed to be seen. She needed to be known, and maybe someone would recognize her, give her a past. They started at the library. Miss Everett, the librarian, was in her 70s and knew everyone in Willoughby and most of the surrounding counties too. She took one look at Sophie and gasped. "She's not from around here, is she?" "No, ma'am," Earl said, "but I was wondering if you'd seen her before. Maybe someone brought her in a year or two ago." Miss Everett leaned in, studying Sophie's face like a puzzle she was determined to solve. "No, I'd remember those eyes," she said finally. "They've got a story in them." Sophie looked down at her shoes. Miss Everett's voice softened. "And you, sweet girl, can come read anytime you like. We've got a whole shelf of books with girls who find their way." They went next to the cafe, then the church, then the post office, Earl, grasping at every possible thread. But no one knew her. No one recognized her. She was a girl without a history, and Earl, a man with too much of one, had no way to prove what his heart already knew, that this child belonged with him. That evening, back at the garage, they sat together in the quiet. Earl tuned an old radio, while Sophie Drew sprawled across the office floor with her rabbit beside her. The static faded in and out until a soft folk melody found its way through. Sophie looked up from her drawing. "Do you think maybe I was supposed to find you?" Earl paused. "I don't know about fate," he said slowly, "but I know timing. And sometimes life puts the right person in your path at exactly the wrong time, because it's the only way it'll change you." She nodded thoughtfully, then turned her paper toward him. It was a picture of the two of them standing outside the garage. She had drawn herself smiling. In the corner, she had written something in careful blocky letters. "Sophie Grace Jennings." Earl stared at the name. His breath caught. "You sure about that last part?" he asked, voice thick. She shrugged. "Feels right." A silence stretched between them, deeper than the cold, warmer than any fire I want to stay, she said. "I don't care if they say I can't. This is my home." Earl looked at her then, not as a mystery to be solved or a burden to carry, but as a gift he hadn't asked for and could no longer imagine life without. He stood up, walked to the old file cabinet, and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside was a picture faded now from years ago. A younger Earl, his late wife Caroline, and their daughter Lily Sophie leaned in curious. "That was my girl," he said quietly. "She would have been about your age now." Sophie ran her fingers gently over the edge of the photo. "She's beautiful, she was. Do you think if she could see us right now, she'd be okay with me being here?" Earl didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and squeezed Sophie's hand. "I think," he said, "finally she might have sent you." That night, as the wind howled louder than before, and the heater clicked with the effort of holding back winter's grip, Earl sat at the desk with a pen and a sheet of legal paper from the back of his old filing cabinet. He wrote, "To whom it may concern. This is my formal petition for emergency guardianship of Sophie Grace. I may not have proof of her birth, but I have proof of her worth. She is kind, bright, and brave. She has survived what most grown men couldn't. And in the short time she's been here, she's reminded me that love isn't about bloodlines. It's about choice. It's about showing up every single day, even when the world tells you it's not your place. Well, this is my place now, and I choose her." He signed it with shaking hands, Earl Jennings. A poor mechanic, but a father once again. The snow came overnight, soft, thick, and utterly silent. By morning, the garage looked like something out of a Christmas card, icicles glinting from the eaves, the gravel drive buried under a blanket of white, and a thin fog rising from the creek behind the property. Earl stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the world turn pale. Sophie was still asleep, curled under her mound of blankets with one foot sticking out, her rabbit tucked under her chin. He hated the thought of waking her. He hated the idea of what this day might bring even more. Caroline Brent from Family Services was due back before noon. She'd said 48 hours, and Earl had never known the state to be late. He glanced at the manila envelope on the desk, the one holding his handwritten petition, Sophie's drawings, and a few grainy Polaroids of their weeks together. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes Earl had learned something was enough. By 10:30, the road in front of the garage was still untouched. No tire tracks, no government sedan, no clipboard-wielding officials. Earl dared to hope just a little. He busied himself with stacking firewood by the side door, glancing toward the driveway more often than necessary. Sophie was inside reading the same book for the third time, occasionally pausing to scribble notes in the margins with a purple crayon. She was wearing that oversized red sweater again, and Earl thought she looked like a spark of life in the middle of winter. He had just finished lining the last log when he heard it, the low growl of an engine, not the familiar rattle of a pickup or the polite hum of a neighbor's sedan. This was smoother, newer, more deliberate. Earl turned heart-sinking. A sleek black Lexus pulled into the drive tires, crunching against fresh snow. It didn't bear any official markings, but something about the car set his nerves on edge. The driver's door opened. A tall woman stepped out, late 50s, early 60s, perhaps dressed in an immaculate gray coat with boots that had never seen mud. Her silver hair was swept into a chignon, her posture the kind that came from ballet lessons and finishing schools. She stood still for a moment, eyes scanning the garage like she was assessing its value, not its purpose. Then the rear door opened, and another woman stepped out, slender, poised, and far too young to wear such a guarded expression. Her hair was dark and glossy, her heels absurdly high for this kind of weather. She looked like she belonged in a law office in Manhattan, not on a snow-covered patch of gravel in rural Willoughby. Earl stepped forward cautiously. "Can I help you?" The older woman's gaze shifted to him. "You're Mr. Jennings." "That's right." She extended a gloved hand. "My name is Marianne Langford. This is my daughter Celeste." The name hit him like a slap, Langford. That was the name on the letter Sophie had once whispered in her sleep. That was the name he'd seen months ago now on the embossed tag of the rabbit she carried like a secret. Langford was money, old money, the kind that built foundations, not fences. Earl's voice dropped. "What do you want?" Celeste didn't speak. She only looked past him toward the garage door, toward Sophie. "I believe you have something that belongs to us," Marianne said crisply. Earl didn't move. "She's not an object. She's a Langford." Marianne replied, each word clipped. "Whether you like it or not, her father was my son. He passed away 2 years ago. Her mother, well, she was never stable. When Sophie disappeared, we thought it was for the best." Earl felt his stomach turn. "You lost her." "We misplaced her," Marianne corrected, as if the distinction absolved her. Celeste finally spoke. "She was left during a party. No one noticed she was gone until morning. My father thought she'd been taken. My grandmother thought she'd been dropped off somewhere. No one wanted to admit the truth." Earl stared at them. "And now, after all this time, you come looking." Celeste's eyes flickered, and for a moment Earl thought he saw something human there. "We didn't know she was still alive. A private investigator spotted her. We traced her here." Behind him, the door creaked open. Sophie stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in her sweater, the rabbit dangling from one hand. She froze at the sight of the strangers. Marianne gave her a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There she is." Sophie took one step back. Celeste looked at her, really looked, and her voice dropped a register. "Sophie, it's me. I'm your aunt." Sophie didn't answer. Earl moved between them instinctively. "You can't just show up and expect her to leap into your arms. We're her family." Marianne said family. Earl's voice was low, steady. "Family is who shows up in the storm. Family is who makes pancakes and reads bedtime stories and patches the holes in the roof so a little girl can sleep through the night." "She's not yours," Marianne snapped. Earl turned slowly, looked her dead in the eye. "No, but she's not yours either." Celeste stepped forward. "We don't want to take her away, not unless she wants to come. But she has the right to know where she came from, and we have the right to ask." Sophie's voice cut through the cold. "I know where I came from." They all turned to her. "I came from a big house where no one saw me. Then I got lost, and then I found a place that felt like home." She looked at Earl. "I found him." Marianne opened her mouth, but no words came out. Celeste blinked, visibly shaken. Sophie took a breath. "I'm not going with you. Not now, maybe not ever. But if you really care, you can write me a letter." The wind rustled through the trees like applause. Marianne turned away, clearly stunned, and Celeste reached into her coat pocket. She handed Sophie a small envelope. "This has my number if you ever want to know more. I'll be waiting." Then they left. The Lexus pulled away, tires spinning slightly on the snow. Sophie stood on the porch, her small hand tightening around the envelope. Earl stepped beside her. "You all right?" She nodded. "I think so." And then for the first time in weeks, she reached for his hand, not because she needed protection, but because she had chosen him. And Earl, a man who had once lost everything, realized in that moment he had just gained the world. The snow began to melt in the days that followed, shrinking into dirty puddles along the edge of the garage and revealing patches of stubborn winter grass. The mornings grew brighter. Softer life as it does crept back into rhythm. Though everything now pulsed with a new awareness, Sophie had a past, a bloodline, a family name with more weight than she could carry. But she'd also made her choice. And Earl, in all his quiet disbelief, had been the one she'd chosen. Still, he knew it wasn't over. People like the Langfords didn't disappear. They retreated, they re-strategized, and then they returned with paperwork and signatures and plans drafted in quiet rooms with expensive pens. But in the lull that followed, Earl did what he always did. He kept moving. The garage had sprung to life again. Word of the girl had spread through Willoughby like wildfire, but not in the way he feared. Neighbors stopped by with clothes, toys, and homemade meals. A church youth group dropped off art supplies. Even old Mrs. Flanders, who once called Earl a godless hermit, had brought over her famous apple crumble and called Sophie darlin'. Sophie helped out in the garage. Now Earl taught her how to check oil levels and patch a tire. She was a quick learner, curious, precise, and strangely fearless with tools. Most days Earl found himself looking over his shoulder and forgetting for a moment that she hadn't always been there. Until one Thursday afternoon, the limo returned. It didn't roll up like some government vehicle on a mission. It glided, black, silent, purposeful. But this time only one person stepped out. Celeste Langford. She wore jeans this time, flat boots. Her coat was still designer, but she looked less like someone arriving to collect a debt and more like someone searching for peace. Sophie had just come out of the garage with grease on her fingers and a smile that made Earl's heart squeeze. When she saw Celeste, she didn't run, but she didn't approach either. Earl stepped forward. Celeste raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to take her." "Then why are you here?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. "To finish what my family never started." Earl didn't take it. "Not yet." Celeste glanced at Sophie, who stood watching warily from the porch. Her voice dropped. "You were right about everything. We failed her. My father failed her. I failed her. And I can't undo that, but I can stop making it worse." Earl's jaw clenched. "So what's this? An official release of guardianship? Claims signed and notarized?" She met his eyes in a deed. Earl blinked. "A what?" "To the Langford Auto Storage property downtown. My father purchased it 10 years ago as part of a commercial redevelopment plan. It's just been sitting there rotting." Sophie remembered it said there was a white piano in the showroom once. Her voice cracked a little. "She asked me why we let it all go to waste." Earl said nothing. "I didn't know how to answer." Celeste continued. "So instead I asked our family trust attorney to sign it over." She handed him the folder. "It's yours now, both of yours." Earl opened the folder slowly. Inside was a crisp deed, Langford Motors commercial property, transfer of ownership to Earl Jennings. It felt like a trick. Why, Celeste shrugged. "Because the name on the building doesn't matter. But the man inside it does." Sophie walked forward now, cautiously but with purpose. She stood next to Earl and looked up at Celeste. "You really don't want to take me away?" Celeste knelt to meet her eye level. "No, honey, I just want you to be happy." "I am." Celeste smiled. "Then I'm done chasing ghosts." She stood. "You don't owe me anything. You never will." Then she turned and walked to the car. The limo pulled away and Earl stared after it, the folder still open in his hands. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Does this mean we own a building?" "I guess we do," Earl said, still stunned. "Can we fix it up?" He looked at her, at the way her eyes sparkled like they did when she figured out how to unscrew a tire valve without letting it fly across the garage. And something inside him, some mixture of pride, fear, and awe, stirred in his chest. "We sure can." he said softly. If you're up for it, Sophie grinned. Can we put the piano back? If we find it, I want to paint the walls blue, she added, and maybe hang up drawings. Not just mine, other kids too. Earl smiled. Other kids? Yeah, ones like me, who don't remember where they came from, but still want to find home. He nodded slowly. That sounds like a good place to start. That night, Earl sat by the fire with the folder in his lap. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, her rabbit nestled under her chin, a drawing clutched loosely in her hand. It was a sketch of the garage with the words, "Home is where someone waits for you." He looked at the deed again, his name typed and official. Legal. Real for most of his life, Earl had been a man of small tools and smaller dreams. He fixed what others broke, patched what others abandoned. He never thought he'd be given something to build from scratch, let alone with a child who had once appeared out of a storm and turned his life inside out. But now, for the first time in years, Earl wasn't surviving. He was becoming, and Sophie his Sophie. Grace was the reason why. Spring arrived not with a grand fanfare, but with small, quiet promises, a warmer breeze. Buds nudging through the frost-bitten soil, the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves. For the first time in years, Earl Jennings found himself waking with purpose, not just to fix cars, but to build something entirely new. The deed to the Langford Motors property still sat in the center of the kitchen table, where Sophie had placed a yellow tulip beside it in an empty coffee can. It looks like hope, she'd said, and Earl hadn't dared to move it since the old Langford building sat on the edge of town, a large, neglected structure with a cracked sign hanging crooked over the entrance and weeds curling through the gravel lot. But beneath the decay, there was something else, space-like potential. The first time they stepped inside together, Sophie whispered, "It smells like ghosts." Earl smiled. Let's give it some new memories. They started with the dust. Every Saturday became garage day. Earl taught Sophie how to sand down old wood and patch drywall. Neighbors began to stop by, first out of curiosity, then to help. Someone donated paint. Someone else offered shelving. The church youth group brought armfuls of tools, and a retired woodworker offered to rebuild the broken front desk. The community didn't just show up, they showed up. People who hadn't spoken to Earl in years shook his hand. Mrs. Callahan from the cafe offered to cater the grand opening before he'd even announced there'd be one. And when a contractor from 2 towns over heard about the project, he brought his crew for free. "I've got 4 boys and no daughters," he said. "But that little girl's smile makes me feel like maybe I had one." Once Earl didn't always know what to say to things like that. But he nodded, and he kept building. Inside the garage, Sophie worked alongside him with sleeves rolled and eyes bright. She'd claimed a corner room with 2 big windows as the art nook and had already begun collecting drawings from local kids. Every week she pinned up more houses, pet stick figure families with hearts for hands. They didn't talk much about her past anymore, not because they avoided it, but because she was too busy building her future. But one afternoon, as they sanded down the old wooden sign out front, Sophie looked up from her brush. "Do you think people can change?" Earl paused, his hand steady on the grain of the wood. "You mean like, become someone new?" "No," she said. "I mean, become who they were always supposed to be." He studied her for a moment. Her face was serious, eyes older than they should have been. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes life breaks us in the exact shape we needed to grow into." She nodded, thoughtful. "I feel different here," she said. "Like I'm not just someone who got left behind. Like I can be someone else." Earl smiled. "You're not someone else. You're just more of who you are now." She grinned. "So what should we name the place?" He blinked. "Name the garage." "You can't reopen a place without a name." Earl laughed. "I figured we'd just leave the sign." "No way," she shook her head firmly. "This isn't Langford Motors anymore. It's something better." Earl leaned against the beam. Mock thoughtful, "All right, boss. What do you suggest?" She tapped her chin dramatically, then her eyes lit up. "Hope and wrenches." He choked on a laugh. "You serious?" "Completely." She grinned. "We fix cars and hearts." He shook his head, chuckling. "You're something else, kid." "Nope," she said proudly. "I'm someone now." A few weeks later, on a bright Saturday morning, a small crowd gathered in front of the freshly painted building. The new sign, Hope and Wrenches, hung bold and clean above the wide-open garage doors. Balloons fluttered in the breeze. Folding chairs had been set up under a canopy, and someone had brought cupcakes with tiny wrenches made of sugar on top. Earl stood awkwardly by the door, wearing his cleanest flannel. Sophie was beside him wearing a blue dress and a pair of beat-up sneakers she refused to part with. She held a small pair of scissors for the ribbon cutting. Before the ceremony started, a silver sedan pulled up at the curb. Earl's breath caught until he saw who stepped out: Celeste. She was alone holding a wrapped box. "I heard there was a grand opening," she said with a soft smile. Sophie approached her. "Did you bring cupcakes?" "Better," Celeste said, kneeling to her height. "I brought something you left behind." Sophie opened the box. Inside was the white piano, a miniature version scaled down, restored, polished to a gleam. Sophie stared at it speechless. Celeste smiled. "The real one's in storage." "Whenever you're ready." Sophie hugged her. Earl swallowed the lump in his throat. Celeste stood brushing at her jacket. "You've done something beautiful here, Earl." He shrugged. "It was her idea. I'm not surprised," she said. Then after a pause, "You gave her what none of us could." Earl looked at Sophie, now showing the piano to a group of younger kids. "No," he said quietly. "She gave me what I thought I'd lost forever." That afternoon, Sophie stood beside him on a makeshift stage and read a few short words she'd scribbled that morning on a note card. "My name is Sophie Grace Jennings. I used to think I didn't belong anywhere, but now I know where home is. Home is where you're loved for exactly who you are, even if you show up lost and messy and scared. Thank you, Earl. You gave me more than a home. You gave me a reason to dream again." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Earl didn't say much after. Just stood, hand resting gently on her shoulder, heart fuller than he'd ever thought it could be. That night, long after the guests had left and the moon hung low over the quiet town, Earl sat on the steps outside the garage. Sophie came out and curled up beside him. She leaned her head on his arm. "You think Mom and Dad would be proud of you?" He looked up at the stars. "I think," he whispered, "they'd be proud of us." And in the silence that followed, Earl Jennings, the poor mechanic who once lost everything, closed his eyes and finally felt whole. The first snow of the new year arrived, quietly fine flakes that drifted sideways in the wind, cloaking Willoughby in white like someone shaking powdered sugar over a world that had for once earned its sweetness. Inside Hope and Wrenches, the space had taken on a rhythm of its own. The garage was no longer just a place where things were repaired. It had become a community. Earl's old workbench had been moved to the back, replaced by a counter, where Sophie kept a jar of lollipops, a guest book, and a cardboard box labeled "Drawings from Brave Kids." They had reopened with a mission: fix cars by trade, fix lives by grace, and they meant it. Earl had agreed reluctantly at first to let Sophie start hosting what she called open bench hours. Every Thursday afternoon, kids who'd had hard starts much like her came to the garage. Some were from the foster system. Others were just lonely. They watched, they drew, they helped clean up tools, and sometimes they told their stories. One boy, Marcus, didn't speak for the first 3 visits. Then one day he handed Sophie a note that simply read, "I think I'm less broken now." Earl kept the note in his wallet. But just as life seemed to settle into something whole, the cold returned, and this time not just from the sky. Earl had been coughing for days, brushing it off as dust or garage crud, as he liked to joke. Sophie noticed first the way his shoulders slumped a little more, the subtle winces when he moved too fast. He claimed it was age. She didn't believe him. One night after he'd gone to bed early without finishing his tea, Sophie slipped into the office and dialed a number she'd quietly written on a sticky note. "Weeks ago." "Hello," came the voice on the other end. "Miss Rachel, it's Sophie, Earl's friend from the county hospital." A pause. "Then is something wrong?" By the time Rachel arrived the next morning, a brisk, no-nonsense nurse in her late 40s, Earl was too tired to protest. She ran some basic tests, asked a series of quiet but pointed questions, then made him sit down at the kitchen table like a scolded teenager. "You've got pneumonia," she said, scribbling on a pad, And you've had it for at least a week, maybe more. I've had worse, Earl grumbled. Rachel ignored that. You need rest, antibiotics, fluids, and supervision. He raised an eyebrow. Supervision. Rachel looked at Sophie, who was hovering near the doorway. She can't run this place and nurse you back to health. So I'm moving in. You what? Sophie burst out laughing before she could stop herself. Laugh it up, Rachel said with a wink. But someone has to make sure you don't try to fix a carburetor while running a fever. Earl muttered something about being fine, but Sophie had already started fluffing the spare pillows in the back room. The next 10 days passed in a blur of broth cough medicine and reluctant compliance. Earl hated being still. It made him feel useless, like a wrench that didn't fit anything. But Rachel was firm, and Sophie, well, she was fierce in her care. She read to him from the garage ledger, updated him on repairs, and even learned how to check spark plugs just to prove she could keep things running. The garage stayed open thanks to the neighbors and the older kids Earl had quietly mentored. Sophie never left his side for long. One night, as a fire cracked softly in the hearth, Earl woke to find her asleep in the chair beside him, her hand resting on his. The sight made something ache in him, not from illness, but from the sheer weight of gratitude. He remembered the first night she'd walked into his life, small, wet, silent. She wasn't silent anymore. Now she filled rooms with laughter, with plans, with hope. She had changed everything. By the second week of recovery, Earl insisted on walking around the garage again. Rachel gave him a hard side-eye, but allowed it as long as he sat every 10 minutes. He did, but only because Sophie timed him with a stopwatch. While he sat at the desk sipping lukewarm tea, she handed him a folded paper. What's this? She shrugged. Something I've been thinking about. He opened it. It was a letter, Dear Mr. Jennings. You may not remember the first time we met, but I do. I was cold and scared and thought the world had forgotten me, but you didn't. You saw me. You gave me pancakes and a name, and a place where my voice mattered. You didn't ask for anything back. So now I want to ask you something instead. Will you let me be your daughter? For real this time, not just in heart. On paper, officially I want to be Sophie Grace Jennings forever. Love, Sophie. Earl stared at the letter for a long while, his hand trembling, just slightly. When he finally looked up, Sophie was watching him, nervous and hopeful. I didn't want to pressure you, she said quickly. I know it's a lot, and maybe it's silly, but Earl stood and pulled her into his arms before she could finish. He held her tightly like something sacred, something that was never meant to be found, but somehow had been anyway. It's not silly, he whispered. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever read. They stayed that way for a long time, father and daughter, not by blood, but by something stronger. Choice, love, redemption. The next morning, Earl made the call to a local lawyer, a kind older woman who'd once helped him settle Caroline's estate. I need to talk about adoption, he said, and I need it done right. The woman paused. Is this about the girl I keep hearing about at the new garage? That's her. She's lucky to have you, Earl. No, he said, his voice steady. I'm the lucky one. The papers were signed in a sunlit office with tall windows and the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. Earl wore his one decent button-up shirt, the same he'd worn to his wife's memorial service years ago, and again to the opening of Hope and Wrenches. He hadn't imagined he'd wear it for anything else that mattered until today. Sophie sat beside him, her legs swinging just above the floor, dressed in a navy blue cardigan and jeans she'd embroidered herself with little wrenches and stars. She gripped his hand tightly, a nervous smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Mr. Jennings, the lawyer said kindly, pushing the final document toward him. One more signature and it's official. Earl looked at the line, waiting for his name. His vision blurred a little, but he blinked it back. He wasn't the kind of man who cried easily. Not anymore. He'd spent too many years learning how to carry loss like a tool belt, always there, always useful. But this moment, this wasn't loss, it was restoration. He signed slowly, each letter steady, and when he looked up, Sophie beamed. The lawyer turned the page to her. And Sophie, this is your turn. Sophie took the pen and without hesitation signed her full name, Sophie Grace Jennings. Then she looked at Earl and whispered, Now it's real. He reached for her hand again and nodded. It always was. The adoption might have only been a formality on paper, but the effect it had on Sophie rippled through everything. She stood taller, laughed louder, dared more. At school, she asked questions. At the garage, she offered ideas how to make the space friendlier for kids, how to add a little lending library near the waiting area. Earl watched her with quiet awe, like he was seeing someone be rebuilt from the inside out. But not everything was smooth. When the school counselor called Earl in a week later, he feared the worst. They sat across from each other in a small office smelling of old carpet and printer ink. Miss Thomas, a gentle woman with sharp eyes, tapped a manila folder on her desk. "She's doing well. Very well, actually, straight A's. No behavioral issues." Earl raised a brow. "Then why the meeting? She had an assignment in social studies." Miss Thomas explained. They were supposed to draw their family tree. Most of the kids groaned or scribbled something quickly. But Sophie... She opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper across the desk. Earl leaned in. At the center of the tree was Sophie Grace. Jennings above her were two large branches. On one side, a heart with the words Caroline and Lily, his late wife and daughter. On the other side, a tree root that grew up instead of down labeled Earl, "Found me in the storm." The roots wound together, becoming stronger as they reached up, forming the trunk below. In colorful block letters, she had written, "Family is who stays." Earl's throat tightened. He looked up. She asked if that was okay. Miss Thomas said gently, "If it was wrong that her family didn't look like the others." Earl folded the paper carefully. "You tell her it's more right than most." Word of the adoption spread quickly in Willoughby, but unlike in bigger towns where gossip slithered into judgment, here it became celebration. The church choir sang a special song for Sophie one Sunday. The cafe renamed its Thursday Pie, Special Sophie's Sweet Slice. And on Friday evening, someone quietly slipped a large, mysterious donation envelope under the garage door. Inside was a cashier's check. $20,000. No name, no note, just the words, "For the girl with Grace and the man who saw her." Earl tried to track it. The bank couldn't trace the source. He didn't try too hard. With the funds, Sophie convinced Earl to renovate the back bay of the garage into a learning workshop. She drew up the plans herself, tables for building a tool wall for small hands, a big chalkboard with the words, "Fix what's broken, build what matters." Soon Thursday afternoons became Community Hands Hour. A mix of repairs and mentorship. Kids showed up with bike chains, broken toys, and sometimes just their stories. Earl found himself listening more than teaching. And sometimes listening was all that was needed. Sophie ran the space like a tiny general. She taught other kids how to use a wrench safely, how to label screwdrivers by size, how to ask questions without shame. One day when Earl complimented her leadership, she shrugged. "I learned from you." "You calling me bossy?" She grinned. "No, I'm calling you brave." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just handed her a rag and told her the lug nuts weren't going to clean themselves. But that night alone in his room, he opened the adoption certificate again. His name. Her name, bound now by more than kindness or crisis, bound by choice. One chilly evening, they sat on the tailgate of Earl's old pickup parked behind the garage. The stars were bright, sharp, almost electric against the deep navy of the sky. Sophie leaned back on her palms, her breath rising in visible whiffs. "Do you think Mom and Lily know?" she asked softly. Earl didn't have to ask who she meant. "Yeah," he said. "I think they knew before I did." "Do you think they'd like me?" He turned to her. "They'd love you." Sophie looked away, blinking hard. "I wish I'd known them." Earl nodded, "I think." "Maybe you do." In a way, she was quiet a moment longer. "Then I used to think being wanted was about being perfect. But now I know. It's just about someone showing up every day." Even when it's hard, Earl reached for her hand. That's all love ever really is. They sat in silence after that, the good kind, the kind where nothing more needs saying. Above them, the stars blinked. Below, the garage glowed warm. And in the space between a girl and a man, once strangers in the storm, leaned into the kind of peace only a chosen family can bring. The early days of summer came gently to Willoughby. The mornings were still cool, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and engine oil. At Hope and Wrenches, the days blended into a golden routine. Sophie hammering away in the learning workshop, Earl back under the hood of cars with fewer coughs and a steadier hand, and kids running in and out like the place was their second home. Sophie had taken to keeping a clipboard by the garage door titled, "Good Ideas Today." It was mostly filled with scribbles from other kids. Some wanted a soda machine, others voted for a puppy mascot, but tucked between the wild ideas were glimpses of something profound. One entry in uneven handwriting read, "It's not scary here." That Sophie said was her favorite, Earl agreed. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived that neither of them had expected. It came in a thick cream envelope, hand-addressed in elegant cursive. To Mr. Earl Jennings and Miss Sophie Grace, Jennings Hope in Wrench's Garage, Willoughby, no return address, no postage stamp. Earl found it tucked between the pages of the Willoughby Gazette, delivered by hand. He opened it slowly, his grease-smudged fingers careful not to tear the seal. Inside was a single page of expensive stationery, faintly perfumed and embossed with the initials M.L. in gold. Marianne Langford. Dear Mr. Jennings and Miss Jennings, I know my presence in your lives was brief and likely unwelcome. For that I offer no excuses, only the humility that comes with age and regret. I was raised to believe that legacy was something passed through bloodlines and bound by names carved in stone. But Sophie, your Sophie, taught me otherwise. She belongs to no one, and yet she gives herself so freely to the world around her. That is strength, that is grace, and you. Jennings gave her the soil in which to grow. I've come to understand something too late in life, and perhaps this is the only apology I know how to offer. I am naming you as a beneficiary in my will. It is not a gesture of guilt, but of respect. The Langford family estate will never be her home, but I hope in some way this might allow her to create homes for others. With sincerity, Marianne. Earl sat back in his chair. Sophie stood nearby, watching him. Is it bad news? He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her brows furrowed, then lifted. By the end, her hands trembled slightly. She means it, Sophie whispered. I think she does, Earl said quietly. Over the following weeks, Sophie became more thoughtful, more introspective. It wasn't that she turned inward. She still laughed, still teased Earl when he forgot where he left his wrench, but her questions grew deeper. What would you do if someone gave you a second life? She asked one morning as they scrubbed down tires. I'd try not to waste it, Earl replied. What if they gave it to you because they finally saw your worth, but only after it was too late? Earl paused. Then I'd forgive them anyway, because that kind of sight, seeing someone clearly, is a gift, even if it comes late. She nodded, biting her lip. That night she wrote a letter of her own. It was addressed to Marianne Langford, care of the Langford estate, but she didn't let Earl read it. She sealed it with gold tape and placed it on the counter at the post office herself. When he asked her what she wrote, she just said, I told her I don't need her name, but I'm grateful she gave me the chance to use mine. Summer deepened, and with it came more changes. The garage now had a weekly class for teens interested in trade skills. Earl taught wiring and carburetors. Sophie taught how to fix a jammed bike chain and read people's expressions when they were hiding sadness. Both had their own kind of expertise. One Tuesday evening, a woman showed up with a boy named Aiden, who had been in 4 homes in the past 2 years. He was thin, quiet, didn't meet anyone's eye, but Sophie greeted him with a wrench and a task. Want to help me take apart an old alternator? He shrugged. You don't have to say yes, she said, but if you stay, you'll get pizza. By the end of the hour, he was smiling. Grease on his nose, a slice of pepperoni in one hand. That night, Earl said, You're doing something real here, you know. Sophie smiled. So are you. I was just fixing engines before you showed up. She tilted her head, and now he looked around the garage, the chalkboard filled with messy doodles, the tool rack labeled with tiny stickers, the shelves of books and toys that hadn't been there a year ago. Now he said, I'm building something that might actually last. One quiet Sunday, they drove out past the lake, taking the long way home. The windows were rolled down and Sophie's hair whipped around her face in tangled streams of sunlight. As they pulled off the road to a familiar hilltop, Sophie pointed. That's the spot. Earl followed her gaze. It was a small clearing overlooking the town. The trees framed the valley, and from here the garage looked like a tiny box tucked into the heart of Willoughby. They sat on a bench, the air warm, the silence easy. Do you miss her? Sophie asked. Your Lily. Earl didn't answer right away. Then every day, but it doesn't hurt like it used to. Sophie looked down, I think. Maybe she sent me, or maybe your love for her left enough light for me to find. He turned to her, stunned. I don't remember much from before she continued, but I remember the night you found me. The sound of your voice. You didn't talk to me like I was broken. You weren't, he said. You were just waiting to be seen. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A necklace. It had a simple silver charm, an engine piston carved beside a tiny engraved heart. I had it made, she said. For you, Earl's hands shook slightly as he took it. I wanted you to have something, she whispered. Something you didn't lose. He swallowed hard, words stuck behind a wall of emotion. You gave me everything. Sophie, he said hoarsely. You gave me back my name. You gave me a future. No, she said gently. You gave me mine first. They sat there until the sky turned lavender. Below, the town carried on quiet, steady and unaware that on that hill a chapter had quietly closed, not in sorrow, but in grace, in gratitude and love that had outlasted storms, names, and even time. Late August rolled in with its golden haze and warm, forgiving breezes. The days stretched longer, the shadows deeper. At Hope and Wrench's, the scent of cut grass and motor oil hung in the air, as the garage bustled with its usual rhythm tools, clinking laughter echoing the quiet hum of second chances unfolding. Earl Jennings stood by the open bay door, a mug of black coffee warming his weathered hands. He was thinner now, a little slower, with gray edging more boldly into his beard. But his eyes, those steadfast, ocean-colored eyes, held something they hadn't in years, peace. He watched as Sophie led a group of kids through a demonstration on basic brake repair. Her hands moved with confidence, her voice clear and encouraging. The children gathered around her like seedlings leaning toward the sun. She was 17 now, sharp, strong, graceful in the way only someone who had learned resilience through storms could be. She still wore her red wool sweater when the mornings turned cold-patched and too short in the arms, but she insisted it was lucky Hope looks better, with scars she'd once told Earl. He never argued. The day marked a quiet milestone. 3 years since the adoption. 3 years since Hope and Wrenches reopened. And exactly 20 years since a little girl with tangled hair and a dirt-streaked face had stumbled into his life in the middle of a rainstorm. 20 years, it hardly seemed possible. The town had changed in small ways. New families moved in the coffee shop, expanded, even the mayor occasionally brought his Lexus in for an oil change. But what hadn't changed was the heart of Willoughby, and somehow, without planning it, Sophie had become part of that heart. Earlier that morning, she had asked Earl to meet her at the hill, the one with the view, she said. At sunset, he agreed, of course, but not before noticing the spark of excitement in her eyes, something just on the edge of joy and nerves. At dusk, Earl drove them in the same beat-up truck he'd been fixing for 2 decades, its engine now purring thanks to Sophie's recent tune-up. They climbed the narrow trail to the familiar clearing overlooking town. The view never disappointed. The golden wash of sunlight spilled over the valley, painting rooftops, fields, and winding roads in molten hues. The garage below looked like a quiet beacon. Sophie laid out a small picnic blanket, pulling sandwiches from a paper bag, and a pair of root beers wrapped in a towel to keep them cool. Didn't expect such a fancy dinner, Earl teased. Well, she said, grinning. Don't get used to it. Tomorrow I start charging rent. He chuckled, then paused, watching her. You're growing up, she looked at him, a quiet warmth in her smile. I'm not leaving you behind if that's what you're thinking. I know, but you've got wings now, Sophie. You should use them. She was silent for a moment, watching the sun settle behind the hills. I got a letter, she said finally. Earl tensed. From the Langfords. She shook her head. From the Community Development Board, I applied for a grant to expand the learning wing at the garage. I wrote about how you started all this. How a mechanic with a broken heart built a sanctuary. Earl's brow lifted, and she reached into her backpack and handed him a letter with the state seal at the top. You got it. She nodded. $30,000. Earl blinked. Sophie. I want to build a second workshop, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Not just for kids, for women. For people coming out of hard places, I want to teach them trades, give them skills, and I want to name it after someone. He looked at her, the Caroline and Lily Center, his breath caught. It won't erase what we lost. she said gently, but maybe it can keep their light going. He didn't speak for a long time. He just reached over, pulled her into his arms, and held her against his chest as the sky turned from gold to lavender. I don't deserve you, he whispered. No, she replied with a grin. You deserve this. All of it. Later, under the stars, they stayed until the air turned cool. Sophie packed up the picnic and they drove back down in comfortable silence. At the garage, the porch light flickered on, automatically casting a soft glow over the driveway. Earl leaned against the truck, looking up at the sign one more time. Hope and wrenches. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a testament. A reminder that broken things, cars, hearts, children, even old mechanics could be put back together if someone cared enough to try. Sophie turned to him. So what's next? He smiled slow and sure. Whatever you dream up, kid, I'll be right here. Years would pass. The garage would grow. More kids would find safety skills and second chances. Sophie would go to school, come home, leave again, and return always with arms full of ideas and a heart still tethered to this place. And Earl, he would grow older, grayer, quieter, but never alone. Because family wasn't made in hospitals or by blood or by names etched on birth certificates. It was made in the daily choice to love, to stay, to believe in someone when no one else did. And that kind of love, it never rusts, never runs dry. It lives on like the hum of an engine tuned just right, like the laughter of a child who once was lost and now is home. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in and what this story meant to you. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel for more emotional and inspiring tales like this one. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that matter. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and remember sometimes the smallest acts of love can change someone's entire life.